since Nancy Pelosi's visit to Taiwan in 2022. The numerous military exercises against Taiwan carried out by the People's Liberation Army PLA have gradually evolved in the direction of surrounding without attacking. The two joint Sword A and B exercises this year have further highlighted this trend. Once upon a time, people generally believed that the war in the Taiwan Strait would be the 21st century version of the Normandy landing. However, this view now seems increasingly unrealistic. Through the exercises, the PLA has been continuously approaching the Taiwan island. On the one hand, this can exert strong pressure on the Taiwan independence political forces within the island. On the other hand, it can also be used to test where the bottom line of the international community lies regarding the Taiwan issue. This approach seems more reasonable for the PLA and can also effectively save costs. In response to this latest situation change, the well-known CSIS think tank in Washington, D.C., in the United States has closely followed the current affairs and launched a round of wargame simulations. So, in the eyes of Western think tanks, what are the motives of the PLA's blockade of Taiwan? And how will it be implemented specifically? The PLA's blockade of Taiwan has clear and definite purposes. It should be noted that Taiwan is an island with extremely limited resources, which is the key focus of the blockade operation. As an economy, Taiwan's dependence on import and export trade is far higher than that of other types of economies. According to CSIS analysis, about 60%–70% of the fields in Taiwan's economic aggregate are heavily dependent on foreign trade. Among all the economies in the world, only the Netherlands has slightly higher data in this regard than Taiwan. In the same field, the Chinese mainland's dependence on foreign trade is only about 15%–20%, especially in terms of energy. 97% of Taiwan's energy and 70% of its food rely on imports. Even if all the coal and natural gas within the island are used for power generation, the total reserves are only enough to last for 2 months. Although the reserves of crude oil and food within the island are relatively more, they cannot support more than 6 months under a completely blocked situation. From a military perspective, the blockade of Taiwan does not need to completely cut off its external connections. As long as the import volume of the above-mentioned key materials is blocked by 50%, extremely significant effects can be achieved. CSIS speculates that if the blockade of Taiwan is fully launched, not only all units of the PLA Navy will be mobilized, but also the maritime militia forces and the Coast Guard will be involved. The PLA's naval and air forces will conduct coordinated operations. After seizing air and sea control, they will implement a cyber information blockade on Taiwan. Although the militia forces will not directly participate in military confrontation operations, they will be responsible for intercepting illegal vessels, especially transport ships loaded with materials. In addition, militia vessels have considerable flexibility and can also be used for the allocation of materials and personnel under the blockade state. The CSIS Center for Strategic and International Studies believes that if the situation really develops to the severe stage of a full-scale blockade of Taiwan, the People's Liberation Army PLA may have 3 different courses of action to choose from. The first option among them is a combination of a full-scale blockade, all-out kinetic blockade, and a shift from exercises to an offensive. This approach is regarded as the most dangerous by many American military researchers. However, from a strategic effect perspective, it also has the highest potential to be an effective way to successfully force Taiwan to submit, without large-scale military confrontation, according to the anti-secession law, which was promulgated and implemented in China in 2005. Under 3 specific conditions, the Taiwan Independence Forces will trigger the military reunification mechanism. First, creating an established fact of Taiwan's secession from China. Second, an obvious trend of Taiwan moving towards secession emerging. Third, the possibility of peaceful reunification being completely lost. In view of the clear requirements of the law, when the above situations occur, the country must adopt non-peaceful means to safeguard its own sovereignty and territorial integrity. In this case, once cross-strait relations deteriorate to such an extent, the PLA can justifiably dispatch naval, air, and law enforcement forces to conduct large-scale live ammunition military exercises in the surrounding areas of the Taiwan Strait. As can be seen from the recent joint sword exercises, such exercises do not even need to be announced in advance and can completely adopt a cold start mode. That is to say, the military operation will be rapidly launched almost at the same time as the announcement. The area covered by this full-scale blockade will be highly overlapping with the areas covered by previous exercises. However, this blockade will far exceed the previous ones both in intensity and duration. In addition to the naval and air forces that have frequently appeared in previous exercises, the submarine force of the PLA is also highly likely to participate in this operation. These submarines will lurk near the ports of important Taiwanese cities such as Keelung, Taipei, Taichung, Kaohsiung, Hualien, and Yilan, and a large number of mines will be laid in the relevant sea areas. These mines, like silent guardians, will pose a huge potential threat to enemy ships and fundamentally restrict the freedom of movement of enemy maritime forces, taking Kaohsiung as an example. Kaohsiung has a crucial Yong'an LNG receiving terminal, which is the largest liquefied natural gas hub in the entire Taiwan region. The CSIS further speculates that in order to cope with possible complex international situations and prevent the interference of external forces such as Japan, South Korea, and the United States, while implementing the blockade operation against Taiwan, China and Russia may choose to conduct joint air patrols in the Sea of Japan between the Korean Peninsula and Japan. All these actions are just preliminary preparatory steps. After the above blockade exercise lasts for about a week, a much larger scale blockade operation will follow. At that time, the PLA will directly issue a navigation ban to comprehensively restrict the passage of ships in the relevant sea areas. After several days of this high-intensity blockade, the PLA's military operation is very likely to be officially launched, thus realizing the transition from an exercise state to an offensive state to firmly safeguard the country's sovereignty and territorial integrity. However, the People's Liberation Army PLA vessels on mission will most likely conduct missile launching tasks at a distance of more than 70 nautical miles from the main island of Taiwan, so as to avoid the anti-ship missile attacks of the Taiwan military. Meanwhile, the aircraft carrier fleet will be deployed to the east of the Taiwan island. In this way, the carrier-based aircraft can launch strikes against the Air Force bases in eastern Taiwan, and at the same time, they can also conduct anti-access area denial operations against the force projection of the U.S. military. Apart from these military operations, cyber attacks, psychological warfare and other operations will also be simultaneously carried out with the aim of disintegrating the will of the Taiwanese military on the island to resist. In short, once the military operation shifts from an exercise to an actual offensive, all available offensive means will be put into use. This operation scenario is regarded by many American think tanks as the most likely blockade version. However, in actual implementation, it will not be carried out completely according to this. The PLA will make full use of all favorable conditions to defeat Taiwan independence and thus achieve the ultimate goal. Among these analyses, the attack on Taiwan's infrastructure is a rather controversial statement, because once these facilities are attacked, it will be very difficult to obtain the recognition of the Taiwanese people. However, if the attacks on them are abandoned, it will easily cause damage to oneself, just like in the early stage of the Russia-Ukraine war in 2022. After the Russian army entered Ukraine on a large scale, it did not destroy the infrastructure. The reasons for this may be to facilitate future takeover, or there may have been a serious mistake in intelligence, or even the Russian army may have had insufficient weapons and ammunition. Anyway, due to the failure to take action against these key facilities, a large number of roadside cameras and anti-theft cameras in residential houses have instead become important factors contributing to the Russian army's heavy casualties on many occasions later. Certainly, the aforementioned scenario is of a relatively tough type. From the perspective of CSIS Center for Strategic and International Studies, there also exists a lower intensity plan. This plan is to use a large number of mines to blockade the sea area around Taiwan, making it difficult for Taiwan's merchant ships to enter and exit smoothly. In terms of specific countermeasures, the People's Liberation Army will not shift from an exercise state to an offensive. Instead, following the model of dealing with the Philippines, a large number of civilian vessels and Coast Guard ships will be dispatched to prevent free passage by ramming or using water cannon against trade ships entering and leaving the island. However, the intensity of this blockade is indeed too low, even if it lasts for several months. It is very likely that Taiwan's foreign trade cannot be completely cut off, but the advantage of this method is that it will not cause too many international disputes. Even Western countries will find it difficult to find a suitable excuse to interfere. The blockade intensity of CSIS's last speculative version is even lower. There is not even the element of mine blockade. It only relies on the Coast Guard forces to conduct law enforcement activities. This will inevitably greatly reduce the blockade's strength, and the time required to achieve the goal will become extremely long among these three scenarios. American think tanks generally believe that only the first scenario is likely to be the fastest and most effective way to achieve a comprehensive blockade of the Taiwan island. Under the condition of high-intensity blockade, significant effects may be seen even within just 1 week. Anyway, in the numerous military exercises in the past, the People's Liberation Army has proven through various means that it has such capabilities. Whether it will come to a full-scale blockade actually depends on the final decision of the political forces within the island. In addition, although there are many unreasonable aspects in the analysis of foreign think tanks, they do provide us with a perspective for thinking about related issues.